Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and we are going to focus on the ability to import info from a custom format text file. This video assumes that you have followed along with fundamentals demo, and specifically that you will have looked at the videos associated with our file reader and buffered reader, as well as understanding how to export the info to a custom file. So what we want to do is we want to think about what type of function or what the function signature should look like in the case in which we would like to be able to pull information out of a file to ultimately put it into an object. And so in the export info, basically what we did is we took the object itself and we utilized a method similar to a toString to be able to format the output in such a way that when we wrote it to a file, we could then conceivably easily read it back in. And so you can see a sample of that file is on the right side of my NetBeans screen in my gmyers.txt. And you'll see that all of the field names essentially prefix the field values, and they're separated with a colon and a space. That pattern, if you would, was rather intentional. And what we want to do now is we want to leverage that. And particularly, we want to leverage a file reader and a buffered reader to be able to read in the contents of a file and ultimately reconstruct an object from a file. And so the idea is that we want to be able to pass a particular piece of information to the function in hopes of getting a feasible or fully working object back out of it. So the only discussion then we need to have is, what does that input argument need to look like? Well, we could conceivably pass it a java.io.file. We could also pass it the path to a file, but we want to keep this one relatively simple in that we're going to make the assumption that the file name matches the Blazor ID in the file. In other words, that my gmyers.txt and my Blazor ID is gmyers, or my user ID is gmyers. So we're going to keep this example simple. We're going to pass to it a user ID or Blazor ID in hopes of ultimately getting the object back out that has all of the information in it. So let's go ahead and scroll down in your fundamentals demo, and we want to find where we wrote our export info to custom. Might be beneficial for you to take just a second to revisit the purpose behind this function, including the try catch, and in this case, the file writer. But what we want to do now is we want to create a new public static function, this time with a return value of EE333.collectedInfo, and we are simply going to call it ImportInfo from custom, and we are going to accept as a input argument the Blazor ID. Again, you can simply substitute this as a user ID. It doesn't really matter, but just to keep consistent with what we've already done. Now, additionally, what we want to do is take just a second to set up this function before we get started with any further discussion. It's going to need to have a return value or results variable, so we'll go ahead and get that set up with the EE333.collectedInfo results, and we're actually going to go ahead and set it equal to null, and we'll talk about why that is a bad idea or possibly a good idea in certain cases. And then we are going to return our results. That way, once again, NetBeans is happy. And go ahead and start off by putting in our comment block. Now, this would be a great time for us to put some notes in as to what our function is supposed to do. And so the idea is we want to read in the contents of a custom format file and create, update an object. And specifically, it's an object of type EE333.collectedInfo. Now, in order to be able to accomplish this, we're going to need several more variables, and this is why it's very important that you have watched the file reader or the buffer reader demo or have some experience with file.io in Java or in another language and framework. So we're going to go fairly quickly through this. We're going to start off, we need to have a java.io.file. We're going to call it an input file. We also want to have a java.io file reader, and the file reader, we're simply going to call it input file reader. And additionally, we want to have a third variable that is going to be a buffered reader. And if you recall from watching the earlier video on buffered reader, this just is a convenience variable that will allow for us to be able to more easily read in the contents of the file using a read line function as a part of the buffered reader. Now, if you'll notice here, I'm declaring each one of these, but I'm actually not initializing them or calling the constructor. We'll do that in just a second. And then if you also recall from the buffered reader example, I needed a variable that was a string. So it's going to be java.lang.string. And we're just going to call it simply line. And this we can go ahead and initialize just simply to empty quotes, but we'll use it pretty quickly. Now, as you know, with the input file reader and also with the buffered reader, we need to have a try catch block. And also with the input file, we can leverage that in order to be able to determine if the file exists prior to trying to open it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a combination of logic here to first check that we have a file that matches our Blazor ID in the correct location. And as a reminder from our ImportInfoFromCustom, we set this up so that it would use a subfolder called users. And in the users subfolder, there would be a gmyers.txt or whatever the Blazor ID.txt. So we're going to use the same approach. And as such, we're going to need to make sure that the Blazor ID is in fact valid. Now we can do all sorts of testing associated with verifying the Blazor ID or the user ID. We're going to keep this one fairly simple, and that we're going to just check to see if the Blazor ID is not equal to null. In other words, make sure that we don't have any null values being passed to our function. And just as a preliminary check, that our Blazor ID dot length is in fact greater than 0. Now these are very poor and very simplistic tests. We would probably want to go a little bit further with that. But at the very least, then in our else, we can have a system.out.println and then put some sort of error or warning that says, please provide a valid Blazor ID. Again, this can simply be a user ID or however you want to go about doing it. Now, inside of our if statement, in other words, if inside of the true branch of the if statement is where we can now use the constructor for our input file. And so we can say input file is equal to new java.io.file. And this is where we want to give it the full path to that text file. And so again, I'm going to pull this up and remind everyone that we are in the user subfolder, and we also want to append the .txt file extension. So at this point, then what we can do is simply specify users. And remember that we need to use the double slashes. The first slash essentially exceptions out the second one, which allows us to use it in the path, much like we did in the export info. And then we'll use the Blazor ID, and then we will append the .txt file extension. At this point now, we have created an input file object. Now be careful, this is not saying that we have a file in the file system that matches it, just simply an object in Java then that we can call methods and do things to. And particularly what we want to do is we want to have some logic associated with checking to see if our input file exists. And if our input file does in fact exist, now we are ready to try to open and read from it. And then, of course, under the else branch, this simply means that fundamentally we have not yet captured the info from the user. And so at this point, it's just up to you and how you wish to word this. You can call it an error. You can call it a warning. Let's soften this a little bit, and we'll say this is a warning. Warning, no info for this user exists. Again, how you word this is up to you, but the idea is convey the information back to the user. Now, inside of the true branch of this nested if statement is where we want to go ahead and set up our try catch. And we want to just for right now, or continue to capture generic exceptions. In other words, whatever happens to be thrown, and simply provide then some sort of message back to the user that there was an error. And we're going to give them a little bit of information, something along the lines of error, failed to open file. And then follow that up with the contents of the exception itself. So system.out.println, and then the EX toString method. Now, at this point, let's focus on the try block. In other words, this is where we want to actually attempt to open the file for reading. And what we're going to do is we're going to call the constructor for our input file reader by saying input file reader is equal to new java.io.fileReader, and we want to pass to it our input file object. And as you saw in an earlier video, we can technically go ahead and pass it the path to a file as well, but then that leads us to a problem with checking to see whether or not it exists. There's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this, and for right now, this is a relatively safe way to go about doing this. And every time you open a file, you always want to remember, at least at some point, to go ahead and close it. Don't exclusively rely on the framework or your garbage collection to close the file. And we want to do the same thing now with our buffered reader. And so our buffered reader is going to be equal to, or rather, our input buffered reader. Let's take a second here to change that. So there's our input buffered reader is going to be equal to new java.io.bufferedReader. And now you'll notice that we pass our file reader object to our buffered reader constructor. And the idea is that the buffered reader will allow for us to read the data out of the file in a more controlled fashion. And just like with the input file reader, we also want to make sure to go ahead and close our input buffered reader in the reverse order in which we have opened them or constructed them. Now, at this point, what we want to do is we want to set up the same while loop that we saw in our earlier buffered reader example or buffered reader demo, in which we'll just simply pull out line by line the contents of the file. But before we do that, we want to start by having a conversation about our collected info results. And so this is not truly an object-oriented approach. If anything, this is a little more procedural, and we get to the object-oriented portion in a later video. But what we want to do now is we want to create that collected info object and then slowly pick out the pieces of the file and put them in the appropriate fields in the collected info. But if you recall back on line 304, we actually declared and then initialized results equal to null. In other words, basically, we can't do anything with it. And if we tried to, it would throw an exception. And so what we want to do now is we want to take our results and we want to set it equal to a new EE333.collectedInfo. Now, if you recall from when we set up our collected info class earlier, we had not really gotten around to setting up any fancy constructors. And so right now what we have is a parameterless constructor that does not require any information at the beginning. And we'll talk about why this is not a good idea later on. But for right now, what we want to notice is that in this parameterless constructor, each one of the fields are set to a default value. And initially, for instance, the first name, last name, and so on are just simply equal to 0-length strings. And I have just arbitrarily put that the goals for the class are to get an A. Essentially, though, none of the fields are null by default, and that is what we ultimately want to focus on. And so the idea is that I have now created a new object called results that has properly declared fields. In other words, I'm not going to accidentally crash something if I call my toString method, for instance. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and set up our while loop just like we did in the earlier video. where we take the output of the buffered reader, not the buffered reader demo, the input buffered reader, and we simply want to read each of the lines, and each line then gets stored into our line variable. And if you recall, then we were simply checking to see that it was not equal to null. When it's equal to null, that means that we have reached the end of the file. And so what we're going to do here is simply loop through all of the lines in the file, looking for field and values. Well, if you go back to your gmyers.txt or your sample file, basically you'll see that we somehow have to pull the field out from the line to be able to establish then which field in the object it gets assigned to. Put another way, I need to be able to identify which line has the first name on it and only capture the information that comes after the colon and the space. Well, to accomplish that, we are going to need another local variable. It will also be of type string, but the difference being is that we want to be able to host an array of strings. The idea is that I want to be able to separate or split the value on the left side of the colon and the value on the right side of the space. And we can optionally include the colon in the space, but it'll show you how we're actually going to be able to remove that. Again, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about doing this, but to start off with, what I want to do is I want to create an array of strings. Now, we've only seen arrays once before, and that's actually in our args, but you should have seen that in a earlier language or possibly in an earlier video. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to call that variable chunks. And the idea is we're just breaking this line up into chunks that are ultimately delimited or split by the colon and the space. And so the idea is I'm going to loop through all the lines in the file looking for the field values. And just to note, they are separated by, and I'm going to use double quotes here just so you can see that we have to include the space. Well, how do we go about doing this? Well, the first thing that we want to do is we simply say chunks is going to be equal to our line dot split. And as it turns out, we can simply specify the pattern that we wish to split our line by. Now, at this point, we should, if the file is formatted correctly, we should get two chunks, the left chunk and the right chunk that was separated by the colon and the space. Well, the first thing that we want to check is whether or not we actually do have two chunks. And so the easiest thing to do is to use a little bit of backwards or reverse logic and check to see if our chunks are not equal to 2. In other words, basically, we had an unexpected number of chunks as a result of our string split. And if we do, we simply then again have a system.out.println. And what we will do is we'll provide some sort of warning to the user that says unexpected data. And at this point, you can just reassure the user that we're actually continuing our processing. In other words, basically, we are fundamentally skipping over that line. Now, under each one of our else ifs, and I just noticed I have a typo here, it's going to be chunks.length, not just chunks. Under each of our else ifs, we simply want to check to see what the value of that first chunk is. Now, keep in mind, this is an array, so this is zero-based in Java. It's square brackets notation. It's all things that you should probably be familiar with already from processing your command line arguments. So at this point, then all we have to do is say chunks square bracket 0, and then equals ignore case. And we simply check to see, does it in fact match Blazor ID. Now, remember, we've already stripped off the colon and the equals. And so that's really all then there is to it to identify if a line has, for instance, the Blazor ID in it. And if it does, we simply take our results and we assign whatever value happens to be in chunks square brackets 1. And remember that this is the second chunk and square brackets 0 is the first, or put another way, this is the right side of the split. And so at this point, you probably already guessed how the remainder of this function is going to go. We're going to go ahead and throw in another else just because, in other words, maybe somehow an additional field got added to the file that wasn't necessary. And so at this point, we're simply going to have another warning because it is not necessarily a true error. And we'll do a couple of these, but then I'm going to pause the video and let you catch up and give it a shot here. So we're going to do chunks square bracket 0 and then equals ignore case. And then let's just go through these in the same order that they are in the file. There's going to be the first name. And if that's equal to true, then at that point, then we simply say results dot first name is equal to chunks square brackets 1. Again, we have no real error checking in here or anything like that. We are simply taking advantage of the fact that we can break this data up line by line, and then again with the colon and the space. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video for a little bit, give you a chance to catch up. I would like for you to go ahead and finish this, go ahead and go through each of the rows. And then when we come back, we're going to test to see if our function actually works in populating the fields of our object. So I will see you in just a little bit. All right, so welcome back. Your function should look roughly like what mine does now. Hopefully I don't have any typos. I have not yet tested it. I'm simply going to build it to make sure that I don't have any syntax errors. And at this point, what we want to do is we now want to go up to our main to create then the if-else statement that will handle this particular demo, or the ability to import our info from custom. So what we want to do now is going up to our main, and we can follow this up with another else if. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to check not only that our args length is equal to 2. Why is it going to be 2? Well, we need to have both our switch as well as whatever the user is that we wish to import. So equals ignore case. And at this point, or in this case, excuse me, what we want to have here is going to be our import info from custom. And then what we need to do, if we're going to successfully call our import info from custom, we need to have a recipient of the return value. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to have an EE333.collectedInfo. We're going to simply call it results, and we're not going to initialize it. In other words, we're not going to call the constructor. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to make a call now to our EE333 fundamentals demo and our import info from custom. And for the argument to the function, we are just going to blindly pass it our args square brackets 1. Now, clearly this is a bad idea. We would want to do some sort of validation of our arguments. But again, that's not the goal or the purpose behind this video. We're going to assume that the second argument that is passed is, in fact, a Blazor ID. At this point, let's go ahead and build it. Let's go back to your command line. we're going to go ahead and call our E333 fundamentals demo, and we're going to pass to it our import info from custom, and we're going to specify G Myers. And at this point, we don't really get a lot of information back. The only thing that we do see in this case is our unexpected data. So let's see if we can get a little bit better of an idea of what is actually going on. Now, we can do a little bit of debugging, of course, but let's do a couple of selective print lines. And so what I mean by that is down here in our import info from custom, why don't we take just a second in each one of these to throw in a couple of print statements. And we're going to start by system.out.println. And we're just simply going to print line by line what we're pulling out of the file. At this point, we're going to build it. Come back over to the console, and you'll see that we are getting the information in line by line, but clearly we've got some sort of problem here. And the next thing that we want to do is check to see how many chunks we have from each one of our And in this case, what we'll do is we'll use a printf. And how about if we just say chunks.length, follow it with a %d, and a new line. Again, we can use both the print line and the printf. And then what we will do is we will specify our chunks.length. Again, we can remove these as we discover what our problem is. I'm just showing you some ways to do a little bit of debugging as we go along. And so it looks like we have the correct number of chunks. In other words, our file is structured correctly. It just means that one of our fields are inappropriately identified. And so what we want to do is go through the fields one by one. We have our Blazor ID, we have our first name, we have our last name, initials, the goals for the class, the goals professional, graduation, computer model, computer CPU, and computer memory. So this is interesting. I apparently have a typo here that maybe if you're following along, you've probably already figured out what it is. And in order to figure out where the typo is, what I'd like to do is I'd like to add one more system.out.println. And what I will do here is I will just simply, again, print the output of the line, and I'm going to turn this earlier one off. We're going to build it again. And if we run it this time, we should see which one is the unexpected data. And so you'll notice here that it isn't a typo, but I have accidentally skipped completely over the languages. So in other words, after my initials, I should be also providing the languages. Now, truth is, I did not spend any time at all verifying what fields I had populated. And so this is actually a really good example of why it's important to bench test your code before you even start running it. In other words, just making sure that you've got everything handled. And now you see that I have handled each one of my fields. In other words, I'm getting no more warnings, but you can see now the benefit of having this. And so at this point, you can decide whether you even necessarily want to have this second system.out.print function. But again, when we run it, we get no information back. Well, that's kind of not the point. Instead, what we want to do is we want to demonstrate that we were successful at pulling the information from the file, creating an object, updating the object, and then returning the object. Well, we happen to have a function that allows for us to do just that. In other words, to demonstrate that we have a fully formed object. And what we can do now is we can simply make a call to our display info in our fundamentals demo. And we will pass it the same results variable that we just constructed in our import info from custom. Build this once again, run it, and now you see that we have been successful at taking the information from a file, putting it into an object, and leveraging, in this case, the toString method of the object. And I realize that it is very subtle, but if you notice, there was one change that we made that demonstrates that we are, in fact, calling the toString. If you notice in the toCustom function, or the output in the file, that the Blazor ID came first. Well, in our original toString method that resides in our collected info, if you recall, we left that order alone based on the sample text that I provided. And so again, just a subtle difference that helps us identify then which function is being called, and to also verify that we have imported the data. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.